Okay. So we are going to continue with our endocrine system today. All right. So when we left off last time, we were talking about basically the pituitary gland and its interactions with the hypothalamus. All right. So drawing real quick, right? We were looking at the hypothalamus. We got an infundibulum, and we got a pituitary gland with 2 lobes. Okay. We're going to have an anterior and a posterior to that pituitary gland. So I'll put A on this side for anterior, P for posterior on this side, so front and back. All right. We've got essentially a dividing line down the middle. And how our hormones work in the anterior versus the posterior is different, right? So our posterior pituitary gland is responsible for our hormones ADH and oxytocin. And the way that that works is relatively simple. Relatively simple, at least compared to the anterior pituitary. All right. Because what's happening in our posterior pituitary is we have neurohormones, meaning we have a neuron, its axon reaches all the way down into the posterior pituitary, and then it does its stuff there. So we're just releasing neurotransmitter as hormone from the posterior pituitary, essentially. Okay. However, in the anterior pituitary, we've got this complicated portal system. So the title at the top here, the hypothalamic pituitary portal system, is really relevant to that anterior lobe of the pituitary gland. And we'll really call our sort of domino cascades of hormones coming from that anterior pituitary. We'll refer to this as our hypothalamic pituitary axis in just a little bit. But fundamentally, what's going on there, right, is we still have, maybe I'll erase that posterior one so that I've got space for our anterior. All right, so we're still going to have a neuron in the hypothalamus, but it's not going to go all the way into our anterior pituitary. So it's going to like stop here. It'll release some neurotransmitters, some hormones, because they're going to go into the bloodstream. We call them hormones, right? But we're still just talking chemicals, right? Okay, so it's going to release chemicals, hormones into our bloodstream. All right, so we're going to have a capillary network. I'm going to draw some squiggles. These are blood vessels, everybody. Okay. So we got a capillary network, and those hormones from those neurons in the hypothalamus go into that first capillary network. We're running out of oxygen, so I'm going to make this a vein next. I'm going to pick blue. All right. But hormones are still just traveling through. All right. And then we're going to have another capillary network in the anterior pituitary. All right. So this is just more blood vessels. Okay. And those cells in the anterior pituitary, some of them are going to have receptors that receive those neurotransmitters that are acting as hormones, right? So we're taking them in, right? So we got some receptors that react to them. And we're then going to secrete our own hormones in response, right? So they're also going to have an out, right? So we're going to be creating our own hormones and putting them into the bloodstream here. And then that blood flow will continue. It'll go to your heart, refresh the oxygen, and then get pumped out to the rest of your body. And we'll have further pathways in our various organ systems, right? So we were defining tropic hormones as part of this, because a tropic hormone is a hormone that regulates the release of another hormone. So when we're thinking about especially these hormones from the hypothalamus, right? The ones that are going to the anterior pituitary, those are going to be hypothalamic tropic hormones, because all of them, their main job is to go to the anterior pituitary and tell it to release a hormone. Some of the hormones coming from the anterior pituitary itself will also be tropic hormones. Those will be the ones that go out to different endocrine glands that release their own hormones as well. So we may have multiple levels of tropic hormones. So that's our kind of summary of what we did last time. Ending, just clearing the drawings. Okay, so it looked like this, right? So we had our hypothalamic tropic hormones getting released by the hypothalamus, entering this portal system. A portal system is just two capillary beds connected in series. So series is when you have a series of things, one then another. I mentioned that because we'll talk about things being linked in parallel in A&P 2. Okay. So we got a series of capillary beds, hormones going into it from the hypothalamus, and then the anterior pituitary makes its own hormones. Okay. This is partially controlled by your brain, things you're thinking about, neural input, things that you're sensing coming in, other hormones. Chiefly, we have a fair amount of negative feedback going on. So once you've produced enough of a hormone, that signal tends to come back and turn itself off. And your circadian rhythm, your sleep-wake cycle, also has an effect on hormonal levels. Okay. This is just a schematic of what it would kind of look like for a generic tropic hormone from the hypothalamus. We have a specific table of hormones on, I think, probably the next slide. Okay, so tropic hormone means we're affecting the release of another hormone. So from the hypothalamus, we've got tropic hormone 1, right? When it's released, secreting is like making something and then secreting it out. So you're putting it out into the world. Okay, so it gets secreted from the hypothalamus, gets in the bloodstream, comes down to the anterior pituitary. Tropic hormone 2 is then being secreted by that anterior pituitary. Okay, and this is a point at which we can already have some negative feedback. Right, so in some cases, as soon as the anterior pituitary starts to release that hormone, blood goes everywhere, right? So that hormone that's coming from the anterior pituitary goes to your heart, goes everywhere, including back to the hypothalamus. So sometimes the presence of that hormone coming from the anterior pituitary will go back and tell the hypothalamus, hey, that's enough. You don't have to make any more. That's our short negative feedback loop here. Or we can have a longer negative feedback loop because that anterior pituitary hormone is going to be going out to endocrine glands. Lots of them are going to be secreting a third hormone. That third hormone, most of them are not going to then trigger a fourth hormone. So these ones would not be tropic hormones, just normal hormones. Hormones being chemicals we're putting into the bloodstream in order to do some signaling stuff. Okay. But that hormone, that third hormone from the endocrine gland, also gets into the bloodstream because that's what hormones do. And we can have long loop negative feedback. Long, meaning we're going like kind of 2 steps up. So we're coming back all the way to the brain, all the way to the hypothalamus. Your hypothalamus sees, okay, so that endocrine gland is already producing this stuff. We can slow down the production of that now at this point, now that I've got this whole system working. So that would be long loop negative feedback, turning off this signal coming from the hypothalamus. Okay. So there are a lot of hormones relevant to this hypothalamic pituitary axis. So this is a table of figures that you can find in your textbook to look at the full picture, but walking through this kind of overview here, we'll be focusing in on specific parts as we walk through this unit. But fundamentally what we're seeing, right, is up at the top of this figure, we have our neurosecretory cells. right, in the hypothalamus. Right, so this is telling us what's up there in that part of the brain. And we've got a list of different hypothalamic tropic hormones. Okay, so here we can see we have prolactin releasing hormone. We have prolactin inhibiting hormone, which is actually the same thing as dopamine. Here we have thyroid releasing hormone. We have corticotropin releasing hormone. We have growth hormone releasing hormone. We have growth hormone inhibiting hormone. We have gonadotropin releasing hormone up here at the top. So all of these are hormones that would come from neurosecretory cells in the hypothalamus, enter that portal system, and lead us into the anterior pituitary. Okay. When you are trying to figure out whether you have a hypothalamic tropic hormone, and you don't happen to remember the full list, would like to point to you that because they're tropic hormones, right, their job is to tell the anterior pituitary to release other hormones. Okay, so they all kind of have very similar endings, right? So we've got prolactin releasing hormone. Prolactin is itself a hormone. We've got thyroid releasing hormone, corticotropin releasing hormone, growth hormone releasing hormone, growth hormone inhibiting hormone, gonadotropin releasing hormone, right? So basically what I'm pointing out here is that regulatory effect is in the name. So if you are just looking at a word and it seems completely unfamiliar to you, although we'll be picking examples we've talked about in class, but if you're having a blank moment, note that because of their job, right, those names are usually going to have that kind of structure here, and that's kind of consistent as a rule of thumb here. Not a law, but very similar kind of naming convention there because those names tell you what they do. Okay. So all of those hormones are heading down to the anterior pituitary. So for example, no surprise, prolactin releasing hormone. We release prolactin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus, goes through the portal system, goes to the anterior pituitary. We have glands there in the anterior pituitary that release prolactin, right? So prolactin releasing hormone creates a stimulus for the release of prolactin from the anterior pituitary. Prolactin related to function of the breasts. So it goes out to glandular tissue in the breasts. So that's how you kind of read this diagram. Prolactin inhibiting hormone or dopamine would have the opposite effect. So if the hypothalamus releases prolactin inhibiting hormone, that has an inhibitory effect, right? Which is why we have inhibiting instead of releasing. So it would go act on those same endocrine cells in the anterior pituitary. It would tell them to release less prolactin. Okay. So we have a couple places where we have a kind of trade-off system as well. We'll talk about various parts of, we'll focus in on various hormone pathways as we talk about the relevant glands and systems. But you should understand this sort of overall overview. Specifically, we'll focus in a little bit on the thyroid gland. Adrenal gland we'll spend some time talking about. And then when we get to the reproductive system, we'll talk a fair bit about the gonad-related hormones and these reproductive function-related hormones. Not saying we won't mention any of the others, but if you're looking for what to like prioritize, honestly, for this unit, probably this set. Okay. We'll also talk about this, and A&P 2 is when we do reproductive, but this will be super important when we get there. Okay, so we're going to do a little practice hormone while you look at the diagram. I don't expect you to have memorized this at this point, okay? But looking at that diagram and making sure we know what we're looking at, right? So when we release GHRH from the hypothalamus, what happens?
Okay, take another few seconds. Let's see how we're doing. Okay, cool. Okay, so when you're looking at that map, right, they are specific to specific anterior pituitary hormones. So you need to kind of like line them up as if they're in columns, like they are in that picture. So specifically, the response to growth hormone releasing hormone, one of our hypothalamic tropic hormones, once it gets into those capillary beds through the portal system to the anterior pituitary, the anterior pituitary is going to secrete growth hormone. So growth hormone releasing hormone is regulating the release of growth hormone from the anterior pituitary. That affects cells throughout your body. And it also specifically goes to the liver, and your liver produces some more insulin-like growth factors that have additional kind of cascade effects on growth. So that's how you would like read that chart and use it. So it's kind of like the mother of all flow charts when it comes to hypothalamic and anterior pituitary hormones. Okay. We're now going to do a walk through some of our primary endocrine glands. Okay. So we're going to just kind of touch base and see where else out in the body do we have glandular tissue that produces hormones. Okay. Some of them we'll dive in detail, and some of them we'll just kind of skim through a little bit. Right. One, your pineal gland. So your pineal gland is up here. It's actually tissue in the brain, right? So you can see it here kind of, let's say posterior to your midbrain, let's say, positionally, all right? So your pineal gland may be involved in circadian rhythms, as well as that suprachiasmatic nucleus that was mentioned on a previous slide. What it does is it secretes melatonin. So if you're taking melatonin to try and help yourself get to sleep, right, you're trying to mimic the behavior of the pineal gland, this hormone that does have something to do with sensing light levels, sensing whether it's day or night outside. In animals that are not us, this is really important for timing any seasonal processes. So this is a hormone that is telling your body when is the day starting, when is the day ending, how long are the days. That's kind of the job of this hormone and this gland. Next gland we're going to think about is the thyroid gland. All right, so the thyroid gland is a gland in your neck. So we've zoomed in here. So we're looking at the anterior neck, your larynx, that's like your Adam's apple. So this is where your voice box is. All right, so here we see the thyroid gland right below it. Okay, your trachea is like your windpipe. Okay, so it's kind of sitting on top of that. Now there are going to be two thyroid hormones. Okay, we're going to call them T4 and T3. So those stand for tetraiodothyronine or thyroxine. This is the more abundant form.
or triiodothyronine is T3. This is less abundant, but it's more active at target tissue. So like at the tissues it goes to, it has more of an effect. Your thyroid in general, one of its big jobs is to regulate your metabolism. So you have hypothyroidism, right? You are suffering from this disorder where you don't have enough of the thyroid function, right? And have issues with metabolism and appropriately processing when you should be absorbing food, absorbing energy, when you should be releasing it, and exactly how that works. Another thing that happens in this area is the release of calcitonin, which is a hormone that regulates calcium levels in the blood. We've seen one of the reasons we might care about calcium, right? So far, we've seen calcium is important when we're thinking about the release of neurotransmitters and hormones, right? Because of those voltage-gated calcium channels that we saw in our axon terminals. We're going to see that calcium is also super important for muscle function as well, among other things. Lots of things that are going on with calcium, but those are two we've kind of taken a peek at so far. So having the right level of calcium is important. Okay. So this is a news article for a while ago, but you'll notice that those thyroid hormone names have iodo in the middle. So one of the reasons why in nuclear disasters or situations where people are potentially anticipating a nuclear disaster, people go for iodine pills is because of this function of the thyroid. It kind of basically absorbs radiation. And if you don't have enough like good iodine, that's a problem, and it remains in your body for a long time. So you're kind of trying to replace that. Okay. They're going to zoom in a little more on those thyroid hormones. Okay. So we have a little pathway we're looking at here. Okay. When we're looking at our thyroid gland, so and point us out. So here we have the blood flow that's going by the thyroid gland. So it's just like kind of traveling along, right? So this is blood flow, okay? And then we've kind of cut into the thyroid gland. So we're seeing an outer layer of cells called follicular cells. And then we have an inner kind of, I think of it as like a jelly layer called the colloid, okay? So this is what you would kind of see if you took a section through your thyroid gland and looked at it under a microscope. So it would probably be much harder to figure out what was going on if you did that in real life. But this is our schematic drawing of what's going on. Okay. So in that central part here of the gland, in the colloid, we're storing a molecule called thyroglobulin. So that's just there kind of all the time. Okay. Thyroglobulin is just hanging out in our thyroid. Okay. Now, the thyroglobulin, under certain conditions, reacts with iodine, and it's going to form that T3 and T4, right? So when you add in iodine to the thyroglobulin, we get T3 and T4. So you can see those here. And you can see that T3 and T4 here. Okay. So reason we're looking at this, that's kind of our setup for understanding what's going on when we think about one of our sets of hormones being released from the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary. Right? If you were to look back at that big map, you'd see that one of our hypothalamic tropic hormones is thyroid releasing hormone. Right? From the hypothalamus, go to the anterior pituitary and trigger thyroid secreting hormone from the anterior pituitary here. Okay. So pointing that out, because in this big old map, in this picture on the right, I should say, right, you can see in the bloodstream that we have that thyroid stimulating hormone here coming down through the bloodstream past the thyroid gland. Okay. So once we have that thyroid stimulating hormone present, it reacts with receptors in the thyroid gland itself, okay, that start to trigger the process by which we're ultimately going to be releasing T3 and T4 into the bloodstream. So here we can see eventually, right, T3 and T4 are themselves essentially hormones going into the bloodstream and then going to be regulating metabolism elsewhere in the body, okay? So we've got TRH coming from the hypothalamus, TSH, then coming from the anterior pituitary. It goes to the thyroid gland, creates this reaction inside the thyroid gland, where we take this thyroglobulin, this TG, convert it into T3 and T4, and then release them into the bloodstream in order to regulate metabolism. It's actually also true that T4 down at target cells can be converted into T3, which is a bit more active in target tissue. Okay, so this is kind of a bigger pathway map of how we end up with these hormones that regulate metabolic function. Okay, so starting with the hypothalamus, going to the anterior pituitary, there's a receptor for that hormone on our endocrine gland, the thyroid gland, triggers the release of these additional hormones, these T3 and T4 hormones that then continue to affect the body. So if we're thinking about those thyroid hormones, we wanted to talk about their chemical properties. We'd refer to them as lipophilic. So think lipids, philic, loving, right? So they like lipids. So they're going to be kind of like steroid-based hormones, right? And one of the ways in which that they can affect the rest of the body is that they can alter rates of transcription of mRNA. So think like we go from DNA to RNA to eventually making proteins. Proteins can act as receptors. They can act as enzymes out in the body, right? So what the thyroid hormones can do is alter the rates at which that process happens. So for example, you could like make more of an enzyme necessary for some metabolic process or some growth process or something like that, right? That's the kind of big picture effect we'd be expecting here. So one disease that's related to levels of thyroid hormones is congenital hypothyroidism. So this is a disorder in which there are insufficient hormones available during development, and this has kind of long-lasting effects. Thyroid hormones also have a calorogenic effect. So what that means is that they are increasing the rate at which the sodium-potassium pump works at the same time as they're increasing the number and size of mitochondria and increasing the enzymes related to oxidative phosphorylation. So those should all be vaguely familiar terms related to metabolism, right? So basically what we're saying is that they are increasing these structures that we need in order to create more ATP, right? So they're making that easier, faster, okay? So they overall enhance a bunch of breakdown stuff. So we mentioned glycogenolysis, right? So breaking down glycogen, right? So that was like a way that we're releasing energy stores. So glucose was stored in these big long chains called glycogen, right? We can break those up, release those glucose monomers so that we can get ATP from them. So that's something that's happening in reaction to thyroid hormones in part. Also enhances how fast you break down proteins, so proteolysis, right? So if you want to use proteins for energy, a thyroid hormone could help you do that. Could also help you break down fats, so lipolysis, right? So lipolysis. So we're increasing our ability to run metabolism quickly, break down different types of molecules. At the same time, it's helping you make more glucose. So gluconeogenesis is making new glucose from other things. Also helps you make ketones. And one of the things from that sort of like regulating the creation of proteins level that it's doing is one of those proteins that it's helping you make is beta adrenergic receptors. So beta adrenergic receptors are all proteins embedded in cell membranes, right? That's the type of chemical that they are, the type of molecule they are, right? We've talked about their function, but they are proteins. And beta adrenergic receptors respond to our sympathetic hormones, right? From that sympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system. So you can imagine big picture, right? You're in this fight or flight situation, right? You got to either fight something or you got to run away, right? It means you're going to need a lot of energy to do either of those things, right? And you're going to want hormones that help you respond to those conditions and help you kind of create that overall response. So we've got that epinephrine, norepinephrine triggering these beta adrenergic receptors that our thyroid hormones have helped us make more of. Those thyroid hormones at the same time have given us all this sort of extra ability to get ATP, right? To make it easier, have more energy to run away or to punch something, basically. So they're kind of working in conjunction then with that part of the nervous system. It's like big picture how the body is working under some of these conditions. So the parathyroid gland, there are actually 4 of them, but they're just little chunks sitting on the back of the thyroid gland, essentially. So now we're still looking at the same region, but we're looking kind of from the back of the neck. Right, so they'd be kind of hidden if you're coming from the front. Okay, just sitting on top of the thyroid gland. So parathyroid glands are small, but they are super important because they are really important to how we're regulating calcium levels in the blood. Okay, so calcium is important for the function of structures we've talked about so far, like nerves, structures we're going to talk about, like muscles, also for the formation and maintenance of bone. Calcium's doing lots of things throughout the body. We are not going to go through an exhaustive list of all the reasons that it's important, but it's doing stuff. Parathyroid hormone coming from the parathyroid glands is one of the really important ways this is being regulated. So we did mention calcitonin from the thyroid gland, parathyroid hormone from the parathyroid glands. It's like working in conjunction with that. It's like really the only job of the parathyroid glands, but they are important enough that if you get like part of your thyroid gland removed, they'll like take your parathyroid glands and just like chuck them somewhere in your wrist or something sometimes so that you can still regulate calcium. So this is not like optional to regulate calcium. Okay. We'll do some drawing next time. We're going to just move ahead on to our adrenal cortex. Okay. So we've mentioned the adrenal glands before, right? We mentioned them in the context of our nervous system. So your adrenal glands are glands sitting on top of the kidneys. So that's what we're looking at here. Sitting on top of the kidneys, adrenal glands, renal refers to kidney, right? When we mentioned them before, what we were talking about was the sympathetic part of the autonomic nervous system. We were talking about how we can have preganglionic sympathetic neurons that go in synapse on chromaffin cells in the adrenal medulla. Right? We talked about how this is the main place where we release epinephrine. Right? So we had this 80% epinephrine, 20% norepinephrine, and a little bit of dopamine release from the adrenal medulla in response to the sympathetic nervous system. Now we are coming back to the adrenal glands to look at their endocrine function. So when we were talking about the sympathetics, we were on that inside part of the adrenal gland, the adrenal medulla. Now the hormones we're looking at in this portion of our third unit is what's coming from the adrenal cortex. So the cortex is like a shell, right? So the cortex is this outer layer of the adrenal gland. So it has its own things that it's releasing. So the adrenal gland does multiple things, basically. Okay. So that's why the hormones listed here are termed adrenocorticoids, right? Because they're from the adrenal gland, but we have to be specific that they're coming from the cortex. The medulla, the inside part of that adrenal gland, is involved with our sympathetic nervous system directly from those chromatin cells. Okay. So from the adrenal cortex, I didn't want to get rid of that. Okay. We are going to have mineralocorticoids, the most important of which is aldosterone. We'll be talking about aldosterone when we talk about the kidneys in the spring semester and think about how we regulate sodium and potassium levels in your blood, which are important for reasons that we can start to appreciate at this point, right? Sodium and potassium were really running the game when we were thinking about nerves. So it's important that your body keeps the right amount of those things. So one of our hormones coming from the adrenal cortex is doing that, or helping you do that. What we're going to talk about and focus on in terms of this unit is this second step, our glucocorticoids. Okay. So we're going to be thinking about glucocorticoids, primarily cortisol. So cortisol is going to be helping your body regulate its response to stress and regulate metabolism. So those two things are kind of linked, right? So regulating stress, right? When we think about stress, we can also think about that fight or flight response of the sympathetic nervous system. Some of that stuff's going on in the adrenal medulla with your epinephrine. The adrenal cortex is also kind of contributing to this stuff as it's releasing cortisol and helping you regulate your energy stores and your responsiveness to stressful stimuli. So we'll talk about that in just a second. The third type of hormone that you do want to know comes from the adrenal glands, which will return in A&P2 are sex hormones, specifically androgens. So think like testosterone. And so everybody actually produces some testosterone because it comes from your adrenal glands, and you all have adrenal glands. Okay? It's one of the places it comes from, not the only place. So sex hormones also come in part from that adrenal cortex. So splitting that out side by side, highlighting the adrenal medulla. It's under neural control, so specifically that sympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system. It's got those secretory cells called chromatin cells that are really just modified postganglionic sympathetic neurons. Okay? They're secreting epinephrine, mostly some norepinephrine, tiny bit of dopamine. Right? And we know that we have all sorts of adrenergic receptors out in the body that respond to epinephrine and norepinephrine to differing degrees, right? So you can imagine if we're releasing a bunch of epinephrine, that's going to change what's going on with those receptors and which of them are reacting more, stuff like that. So that was all on the inside part of the adrenal gland and the adrenal medulla. Now we're highlighting what's going on with the glucocorticoids coming from the adrenal cortex. Okay. All right, so we're in the outer shell of the adrenal gland. That's where we're going. Okay, so the way we get there, okay, is two things kind of affect your hypothalamus, is eventually going to run down and affect your cortisol secretion. So both stress and your circadian rhythm have an effect on this pathway. So you actually have natural kind of levels of cortisol secretion, and then like naturally higher levels and lower levels throughout the day, so that you can wake up and kind of have energy and then like be relaxed and fall asleep. So that's kind of the role your circadian rhythm is playing, right? Is that cortisol is part of your kind of sleep-wake mechanism. But stress is also a big thing as it relates to cortisol. So stress, think you are stressed out, right? That's the kind of stress we're thinking about, not like someone's trying to bend you. Okay. So under these conditions of stress, your hypothalamus releases CRH, corticotropin releasing hormone, right? So we can recognize that it's a hypothalamic tropic hormone, either because we remember that we talked about it, or because we see that releasing hormone bit in the name, which is a hint for us, right? And we can see corticotropin, right? We can kind of see already that adrenal cortex part in this word already. So that is another way we can kind of give ourselves clues for where we're going, even before we think about the whole pathway. Okay. So corticotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus goes through the portal system into the anterior pituitary. And there, it causes the release of adrenocorticotropic hormone. Okay, so adrenocorticotropic hormone is where we get ACTH, right? So in general, we had an indications from the cortex here in that name of the hypothalamic hormone. Now the name of the anterior pituitary hormone is even more specific, right? So adrenal cortex tropic hormone, right? So this ACTH is getting released from the anterior pituitary, going into your bloodstream, returning to the heart, getting pumped out through your vasculature. Some of that blood flow goes to the adrenal glands. And from the adrenal cortex, that outer part, this triggers the release of cortisol. So this is how we get the adrenal gland to release the stress hormone, essentially. Right? So cortisol secretion is happening in response to this hypothalamic pituitary axis. We've got a big kind of like waterfall kind of flow of hormones going on here. We do have negative feedback here. So once you have substantial amounts of cortisol, right, your anterior pituitary and your hypothalamus are both going to sense that you have a lot of cortisol already in your body. And so hopefully they will stop releasing so much of these tropic hormones so that you can mellow out your cortisol levels eventually, right? We don't want runaway positive feedback here, right? So that's this big flow. Okay. And then we want to think about the actions of those glucocorticoids, right? So cortisol is one of our hormones of stress, really our main hormone of stress. When we think about stress markers and responses to stress, we often think about cortisol. So it's regulated by the hypothalamus and anterior pituitary through these two other tropic hormones, CRH and ACTH. So we might call this a CRH, ACTH axis. Axis just kind of like a line, like a central point, right? And cortisol is going to help you mobilize energy stores. So again, we're thinking metabolism-related function. It also suppresses the immune response at the same time. So this is one of the reasons you might see deleterious bad effects of cortisol. Is this suppression of the immune system if you long-term have really high levels of cortisol, long-term have really high stress levels. This is going to do things to your body that are not really what you would intend or ideally want. So when we think about stress, we do have a big picture view, or we want to have a big picture view because there are a lot of things going on. Okay. So cortisol is important in the stress response, but we can also think about a stereotypical response to stress called general adaptation syndrome that pulls together a lot of different pieces, right? So it's not just cortisol, it's not just this endocrine function. We need to like kind of pull together what our nervous system is doing at the same time, what other hormones are involved here. All of this as a group is getting us towards this fight or flight response, right? So our overall response under times of stress, right? If you're stressed out, something's trying to attack you, essentially, or you feel like something's trying to attack you, right? You want to either fight back or you want to run away. Means you're going to need energy to do either one of those things. You also want to maintain blood pressure because you want to get enough oxygen to your cells in order to produce ATP and run away or fight. We have a lot of different hormones and parts of our body that are all focused on making sure that that happens. And so we'll pick up there next time and dive into that a bit more.